Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm delighted to be hosting this evening's program on behalf of the Mark Twain House and Museum. We're an hour earlier than we usually go, so I hope that all of our regular audience members have made the transition and will be joining us in a few minutes here. I'm really excited to be hosting tonight with Alex Segura and Silvia Moreno-Garcia. We've just spent a few minutes talking in the green room, and I promise you this is going to be a really interesting conversation. I'd like to get to that conversation as quickly as we can, so I'm going to make my housekeeping remarks very, very brief. First of all, again, I just want to welcome you on behalf of the Mark Twain House and Museum. You know, the museum started doing virtual programs very early in the pandemic, April 2020, and since then has done hundreds and hundreds of them, sometimes as many as 4 or 5 or more per week. And it's been really gratifying to see people from all over the world joining us for these conversations with authors of all kinds of, in all genres and all levels of areas of interest. So it's just been a really great experience. I would say, though, that while the museum rarely charges an admission fee or a registration fee for these programs are not free for the museum to mount. And so I would ask you to please take a look at the long green button that's right beneath my face. It says, "Your support is vital. Click here to donate to the Mark Twain House and Museum." If you've been a regular and have been enjoying these programs right along, if this is your first time joining us and you find you enjoy the experience, or if you're somewhere in between, I just want you to know that anything you can do in the way of clicking that button and supporting the museum through your donation is deeply, deeply appreciated by the Board of Trustees and the staff of the museum. And I guarantee you every single penny is put to very, very good use indeed. So thank you in advance for your generosity if you're able. I also want to point out the chat where you all are already chatting away. Hi, Mary Lou. Great to see you again, too. The chat is one of the funnest things about the virtual format. And I always like to remind myself that when you're sitting in an auditorium listening to an author talk, you can't be chatting among yourselves, but it is perfectly wonderful to do so during these virtual programs. So please continue to chat. Know that this program is being recorded. And pretty much immediately after it concludes, an hour from now, it will go. It'll be available for you to watch again simply by clicking the same link that you used to get here in the first place. So the program is recorded, but the chat remains live in perpetuity. So if you were, for instance, to come back and watch it again another time, perhaps you had started a conversation with somebody or made a connection, you can continue that conversation in the chat anytime you like. So that's fun. So the chat is the chat, and that is a lot of fun, but we are going to do an audience Q&A toward the end of our program tonight. And if you do have a question for either of the authors who are joining us tonight, rather than post that in the chat, if you could do me the favor, please, of posting your question in the Ask a Question area that you see right in the middle of the screen at the bottom. That makes it a lot easier for me to manage that part of the program when we get to it. So please take advantage of that. And know that if you see somebody else's question and you have the same question, you can click on it and upvote it, and that takes it to the top of the pile. So having said all that, I just have some thank yous to do before I introduce our guests. I neglected a very, very important thing, though, in the chat, and we'll repost this many times during the program, but at the very top of the chat is a link through which you can purchase your own signed copy of the book we're talking about tonight, Alex Segura's Secret Identity. So we're not dummies. We know that you can purchase this book elsewhere, but do know that if you make the purchase by clicking that link, not only do you get a signed copy, which you don't get everywhere, but you also are supporting the Mark Twain House and Museum through your purchase. So please consider doing that as well. We're very grateful to our sponsors. Tonight's program, like all of our virtual programs, is sponsored by the Wish You Well Foundation and by Connecticut Public WNPR. And it's produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord, who was a much beloved trustee of the museum, who passed away last year. And the museum is delighted to honor his memory through these virtual programs. If you want to know about upcoming virtual programs, please visit marktwainhouse.org. And increasingly, I should say, the museum is starting to offer in-person live events as well. So if you are in the greater Hartford area or nearby enough that you could get to the museum, please check out those offerings as well. And that's very, very exciting. So having said all of that, let me introduce our speakers tonight. Our moderator tonight is Silvia Moreno-Garcia. She's Mexican by birth, Canadian by inclination. She's the author of a number of critically acclaimed novels, including Gods of Jade and Shadow, Mexican Gothic, and many, many others. And she's got a list of awards a mile long that you can read if you check the bio that's included in the description of tonight's event. She's edited several anthologies, including She Walks in Shadows, and she is a columnist for the Washington Post. Silvia has an MA in Science and Technology Studies from the University of British Columbia. You can read her thesis online. It's called Magna Mater, Women and Eugenic Thought in the World of H.P. Lovecraft, and she joins us from Vancouver, British Columbia. Silvia is going to be in conversation with Alex Segura, an acclaimed award-winning writer of novels, comic books, short stories, and podcasts. He's the author of Star Wars Poe Dameron, Freefall, and the Pete Fernandez mystery series, including the Anthony Award-nominated crime novels Dangerous Ends, Blackout, and Miami Midnight. His short story Red Zone won the 2020 Anthony Award for Best Short Story, and his border noir short story, 90 Miles, is included in the Best American Mystery and Suspense 2021. That also won the Best Short Story Anthony Award for 2021. He's a fascinating person. He's written a number of comic books, most notably the superhero noir, The Black Ghost, the YA music series, The Archies, and the Archie Meets collection of crossovers, featuring real-life cameos from the Ramones, B-52s, and many others. I could go on, but I think rather than have me keep introducing our guests, why don't I just bring them on screen and you can meet them in person. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a great big Mark Twain House and Museum welcome to Alex Segura and Silvia Moreno-Garcia. And give me just a moment to finish bringing them up on screen. Oh, Silvia, I'm having trouble with your mic. Let's see what we can do there. So, Silvia, I'm going to ask you if you can, still having trouble. So Alex, bear with us. Audience, bear with us. I'm sorry about this. So Silvia, would you be able to leave the crowdcast and come right back in, and we'll see if that reactivates your microphone, please? Thank you. It is always something in
no big deal. This stuff happens all the time.
Alex, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. And how are you doing? How's the book launch going?
Good. It's been busy. The response has been great. I'm happy that people seem to be liking the book, and just doing the rounds of virtual book tour.
Well, good for you. Congratulations. And it looks like Silvia made it back. Silvia, you can hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Awesome. Fantastic. Well, I think I'm going to duck out now and just sit back and enjoy the conversation with everybody else. But we are going to do that Q&A session toward the end. Silvia, will you let me know when it's time for me to hop back up and help with that, please?
Yes. We'll be chatting for half an hour. So everybody, please put your questions in the Q&A box. At the 40-minute mark, we'll be turning over to the Q&A portion of this session. So thank you very much.
All right. Enjoy.
Thanks so much. Hey, Silvia, how's it going?
Hello, Alex. Good. So how many days has it been out?
It came out the 15th. So what day is it today? It's almost 2 weeks. Yeah, 2 weeks. It's exciting. Right. Yeah. I mean, you know the drill. It's always an adventure when your book launches.
That's right. Congratulations on this new one.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, I mean, you've written a bunch of other books and you've done a lot of other stuff, and you wrote a whole mystery series, the Fernandez series. But that was for a smaller publisher, and this is you're jumping to the big leagues. So what's it like? What are the differences? What have you noticed? What can you tell people out there?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, my first 5 novels, the Pete Fernandez novels, came out from Polis Books, which is a it's an indie publisher, but they have great distribution, but it's very different. I mean, this too. You have more resources. I think the major publishers have more reach, more of a marketing budget. So it's funny when talking to other writers, I would say things that I think were more like an indie author mentality, like, oh, I need to follow up with this journalist, or I need to check on this. And my friends would say, no, you have a team. You have a team, which is amazing. You have a publicist, you have a marketing person, and I know it varies. Everyone's publishing experience, even at the big publishers, is different. It's not always fantastic, but this one felt very, I have no complaints. Flatiron was really supportive. They got behind the book very early. They were open to a lot of the unique ideas. I mean, there's comic book pages in the novel, so that's not your standard structure. So how was it for you? Was it different, making the leap? I know you've done some indie publishing, but the majority of your stuff has been with big publishers.
Oh yeah, I've been half and half, like lots of smaller publishers and all that. And yeah, there is a big difference in distribution and reach and that kind of stuff. But you also made a switch, not in genre necessarily, because it still falls under the umbrella of crime, but a mystery series with several volumes with an overarching character that reappears is different from what you're doing now in Secret Identity. So how was that, moving from having a series of novels where, you've got 5 going, you've got to keep it going, to this one volume, where, as you say, you're also integrating elements like comic book panels. So it's very different from your previous work.
Yeah, it was, I guess, in simple terms, it felt like, with the Pete books, I was writing kind of a TV series almost. Like every book was almost a season, and you'd have that arc for the book, but then you have the bigger arc for the series as a whole. And so with Secret Identity, it felt much more, I guess, cinematic. Like, I am going to revisit the world in a sequel, but it's not going to be a direct linear sequel where you pick up like after the last page. It's going to be a spiritual sequel in some ways. But I think it was liberating too to know that this singular arc is going to tell the story, and there's not going to really be much else. Like Carmen's arc in this story is her key moment, and there'll be more stuff later. But with something like the Pete books, I always had to be mindful of the next book or the next 2 books. Like if I kill this supporting character now or something happens to them, I might have to deal with the repercussions for a long time. Whereas with the standalone, the repercussions are much smaller. What happens in that book is really the be all and end all. So.
And in terms of the genre of this book, it is taking a lot of elements from comic books, and you have a background in comic books. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got into that and some of the stuff you've done through the years?
Yeah, I grew up a comic reader. I mean, my first comics were Archie comics, those digests that we got them at the grocery store as a young child. And that kind of opened the door to the medium to me. And I was a lifelong fan. And then I just made it my professional career. I went into publicity and marketing and a little bit of like comic book journalism, interviewing creators and doing stuff like that as a fan. But I got the opportunity to write a fair share of comics, whether Archie stories, like music themed Archie stories, like Archie Meets Kiss or Archie Meets the Ramones and things like that. And my own creations like the Black Ghost. And a lot of that, I grew up reading them. So it was such a dream to be able to not only write just Archies, but to write comics, period. And so I've always had that dual love of mysteries and genre novels and also comics. And I remember in college reading something like The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which is a novel, but it's set in the comic book industry of the golden age of comics, like the late 30s, early 40s. And I remember being really taken by that and thinking, why hasn't anyone ever done this before? And that idea kind of just hovered in the back of my brain for a long time. And so when I was finishing up the Pete novels, I thought my next thing would be a murder mystery in comics. And I knew I wanted to integrate actual comics into the story because that meta conversation, you're reading the comics Carmen is creating while also reading Carmen's story felt really interesting to me as a reader. Like I would want to read that kind of book if it was done well. And so that was a little bit of a challenge. It was a little bit of a harder sell as opposed to saying, hey, it's a murder mystery in comics and it's just going to be a straight novel. And at the end you solve the mystery. But in many ways, I wanted that challenge. I wanted to go into something a little bit more complicated than, I love PI novels, but PI novels also are a subgenre and there are tropes that you have to honor or flip or tweak. And I wanted to do something that was a little bit apart from that. Carmen is an amateur detective, but only because the thing that's most dear to her, this creation, this character, is taken away from her. I don't think under other circumstances she would be compelled to solve murders. So I don't know if that really answered your question, but.
No, thank you. And in terms of research, you said that this was a little bit harder than you thought it would be, I think.
Yeah, it definitely was. And it's a blessing sometimes when that happens, because you get really deeper into the weeds and become really immersed in the material. I was reading a lot of comic book histories just for fun around the time. That's what really pulled me towards doing a murder mystery in comics. But once Carmen showed up, and in the way that characters sometimes appear, and you see them and you're like, this is the person that's going to be the protagonist, I knew I had to speak to, women that worked in comics at the time to just give me a sense of whether the way I was writing Carmen's experience was accurate, and also fact checkers, because my knowledge of the comic book industry is limited to the 2000s and beyond. Like I didn't really know what the production cycle for a comic book in 1975 was. It was a very different world. There were no comic shops, there were no comic book conventions. It was directly just feeding to the newsstand. And so I wanted to just make sure those facts and things like that were correct, but also added to the texture of the story. And that was challenging. It was probably the most journalistic book I've ever written, but it also in the process became a lot of fun, just interviewing people, getting feedback from different readers. And I'm not the kind of author that sends my book out to like so many people early on. I don't know if you are, but I like to keep it under my cap for a while. But so this was a different process. It was a lot of not collaborative, but getting a lot of feedback, and also collaborating on the comic book sequences, which was a new way, a new twist to the process.
What were some of the people that you interviewed and talked to?
I spoke to a lot of women that worked in comics, like Louise Simonson, who wrote books like the X-Men and New Mutants and X-Factor and Superman for a long time, and worked as an editor around the time period of Secret Identity. I also spoke to Linda Fight, who wrote this comic called The Cat for Marvel, which was the first female superhero written by a woman at Marvel, and it came out a few years before Secret Identity is set, and so there's a little bit of a nod to it in the novel itself. And Laurie Sutton, who worked at the Comics Code, which was this committee of different publishers that was created in the wake of the 1950s witch hunt, I guess, on horror comics. And so the Comics Code was like the seal of approval, and there would be employees that would sit and read every comic before publication to vet them and approve them. And so Laurie was an employee much later, when the Comics Code had loosened its kind of rules, but she was helpful. And also Karen Berger, who is the founder of Vertigo, which was DC's mature readers imprint. And she came into comics a little bit later, but I wanted to have some context about what it was like to just be a woman in comics at the time. And it was really informative. I also interviewed Sean Howe, who wrote Marvel: The Untold Story, which was a kind of an unauthorized history of Marvel Comics. And I could tell that in the reading of his book that he was particularly fond of the 70s. And so we chatted a little bit about that. And trying to think who else. It's a long list. And Paul Levitz, who was the president and publisher of DC, but also a very prolific writer, mostly known for his work in the 70s and 80s. And so he wasn't reading it so much for entertainment. He was just reading it kind of to fact check it, which I found to be super helpful. And Jerry Conway, who wrote a ton of classic Spider-Man and stories like that, and he gave a lot of like fun little anecdotes that made their way into the story too. So it was a collection of different professionals and for different reasons, but it was really a fun process.
How long did you work on this book?
I think the writing itself came quickly. I outlined it and had a big chunk of it written before we went out to shop it. And before then, that was when kind of the interviews were going on. And I still was interviewing people while writing, because I'd run into something and think, well, I need some context to make sure that this works, or it would be great to have an anecdote that fits into this. Like there's a scene where Carmen's playing a volleyball game where Triumph is playing another comic book publisher. And that actually happened. Every week, Marvel and DC would play volleyball at Central Park. And so those little things kind of came as they went. So I think overall it took about 8 to 10 months, like from beginning of like starting the outline, selling the book, finishing the draft, and then having the manuscript when you enter copy editing. So I guess 8 to 10 months, which is longer for me. Usually I'm a bit faster, but it was kind of worth that extra time.
Was there an anecdote that you couldn't include that you wanted to, that you could tell us about now?
No, you know, there was one that almost didn't make it, and for some reason I didn't realize that I had forgotten that I had put it in the book. But there's a moment where Carmen mentions offhand that an employee almost got fired for throwing like a steaming cherry pie at a colleague, and that was an actual anecdote that this guy Scott Edelman told me about. And I remember putting it in, and I remember taking it out, and I guess I must have put it back in because it's in the final version. But it's a funny like little nod to like the hijinks of comics. And there was one, and you know this writing historical fiction, that sometimes you weave in actual people to create that sense of verisimilitude that this actually could have happened. And towards the end of the book, there's a moment where Carmen kind of needs an ominous guide, like a character that will nudge her in the right direction. And I had a real person, a real comic book person that had passed away, but I had woven them into the story. And then for whatever reason, it didn't click, it didn't work. And it made more sense to have it be a fictional character, but that was kind of the road not taken, but it would have been interesting.
Cool. And I mean, noir is not exactly the most popular genre.
Yeah.
These days, or that's what my publishers have said whenever I come up with that idea. Did you have any pushback? Any people that were like, no, maybe not this genre, maybe try something different? Or was it like, yes, we want it kind of situation?
You know what's funny? It's funny because I think the comic book elements offset whatever preconceived notions people have about noir. I'm super curious to hear what your definition of noir is, because I'm like a stickler for my definition of noir. I feel like the term has become so generic, like people just use it as interchangeable with hard boiled or mystery or crime. And to me, it's something very specific. I'd love to hear what you think it is, how you define it.
It is something very specific. It's not a mystery, and it's not necessarily a hard boiled, and so it's a different thing. Yeah, it's a different beast.
Yeah, do you have like rules of what a noir is, or to you, or?
Yeah, I mean, I have the definition by the guy who coined the who coined the name, the term, and he said that it was fiction that essentially focuses on the microscopic, on character and emotion. And even if there's action, the most important part is the emotion, and it's all tied to this kind of like sub-world in that sense. So what happens is that I think noir gets confused with other kind of like its cousins, and there doesn't need to be a mystery in a noir. Some of the great noirs don't have any mysteries. You know, in the postman rings twice. There's no mystery about who killed somebody, from the beginning. It's just this kind of like X-ray of a person, basically.
Yeah.
It's a lot about character. Yeah. And so in domestic noir, which is another cousin of it, that focuses like on women of a certain class and certain kind of problems, is also often confused with noir. So yeah, I think it's a case of people thinking that it's something else and sometimes not liking what it really is. So once they taste it, they're like, I don't want this. I wanted a mystery, or I wanted something else.
Yeah, I think
in your case, there is like a problem that needs to be solved.
Yeah, I would say it's a noir, but there's obviously a murder mystery. But for me, noir is when people are put into situations where they have to make a split-second emotional decision, and then they either have to claw their way out of the consequences of that decision. It's basically, it's a very primal thing, like you were talking about. It's very character-driven. It's less about the mystery, even though Secret Identity is a murder mystery. It's much more about being in Carmen's head and realizing what's driven her to go to these lengths to solve the problem. But yeah, I'm glad we're both sticklers for some kind of definition to noir.
And what are some of your favorite noirs? Like that maybe you drew inspiration from some of this stuff, or was it like comic books that clearly inspired this?
No, I think the authors that I found myself going back to the most while writing this were Patricia Highsmith. I really love, now it's more in the news because of that Ben Affleck movie, but Deep Water is one of my favorite Highsmith noirs. Obviously, Strangers on a Train, the work of Margaret Millar. I think Beast in View is so underrated still, and it's really kind of a signpost to some later books like Gone Girl and where the trends went more recently. But and there's this novel by Vicki Hendricks that's one of my favorite Miami noirs, Miami Purity. That's just a very sexually charged, intense, dark novel. But like you said, it doesn't have a mystery to it. You're just like peeking into the character's mind and exploring it. And yeah, and in terms of comics, I read a lot of 70s comics that some I had read, but also I focused on female characters because I wanted the Lynx to evoke the time, like to really feel like a comic of that time, as opposed to like two modern day comic book creators trying to riff on what it would be, or trying to copy what came out at the time. So stuff like Spider-Woman, Mrs. Marvel, the Wonder Woman books of the time, and for good or bad, like there's some clunkers of that era, but in Secret Identity, you see different creators take on the character. So you kind of see what Carmen's vision for the Lynx is with the artist, but then you also see what happens when she loses control and like a more hack writer or artist take over. So I wanted to, because we know this, but I think also a lot of non-comic readers don't really understand that it's people creating these books and they change, sometimes, and that'll affect the tone and vibe of the story.
How did you handle that lack of knowledge? I mean, I know sometimes you get readers who are like, no, it's too much explaining, too much talking, not enough action, kind of too much tell, no show. Yeah. But obviously when you're going into a different time period and you're going to an industry that is as potentially intricate as is comic books, there is a lot of telling, a lot of information that needs to happen for you to understand the context of the world that we're going into. So how did you handle that? Or did you just say, you're getting a lot of telling, guys?
There was a lot of telling. I think where I pumped the brakes a little bit was in the explaining of stories and the significance of stories, because I wanted to give the texture, like, when Carmen and Harvey are talking about Jim Starlin and Captain Marvel and Adam Warlock, like I could have very easily veered into a couple paragraphs explaining who those characters are and why they're important and who Jim Starlin was. And I think I wanted to just give the reader enough that if they were intrigued by these details, they could find their way and decide if they wanted to read it. I think I only cheated once, and there's a moment where Carmen is talking to Rich Berger, who's kind of an editor at the company and an older friend, and they start talking about Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams and their Batman work. And that was like my one detour where I gave a nice little love letter to that kind of work. But in terms of the logistics of comic books at the time and the industry, I tried to just keep it succinct and tried to, I wanted to explain it for the purposes of the story, but it was hard. It was a hard balance to strike, because it's very easy to fall into like the Wikipedia-ing of history. You want to recap and explain everything, but I tried to kind of lean more towards atmosphere and let the reader kind of dig deeper elsewhere if they needed to. Like if there was a book that they found interesting, or, something that piqued their interest, that I didn't necessarily have to explain in detail for the purposes of the plot, I hope that they're able to kind of find it on their own.
And for you,
did you have that challenge with with Velvet Was a Night? There's so much historical background. Yeah. How did you strike the balance?
Yeah, I don't know if I did.
I thought you did. I was so entertained by that book.
Yeah, I think it's always hard doing historical. A lot of people don't have like necessarily the cultural context and the temporary context. In my case, to know what's going on in a different country. A lot of acronyms. Yeah. But I just hope that, like you say, Wikipedia exists, and so it's pretty easy, I think, to Google things. I don't know why people sometimes don't Google enough. I Google everything whenever I read a book like this that combines like real stuff with fake stuff. I'm always trying to look for where the fakes are, because if it's well done, you can't tell so easily. So I'm always like Googling.
Like, oh, good. Yeah. So were there some things that you realized?
What was that? Yeah.
Because I weave in actual characters, like like the Black Ghost is mentioned in there. The Dusk, like those are books that I've published as a writer. But when you're creating stuff like this, you need little spaces to create like fictional characters to weave into history. And I thought, well, why don't I just include characters that I already own, that already, I can just retrofit them into this kind of expanded universe. But yeah, I'm the same way. I don't know if you're a James Ellroy reader, but a lot of his books weave into actual events, and it's almost like putting a puzzle together. You're trying to figure out which is real and who are the fictional characters and how does it all make sense.
Yes, I like that. It's quite fun. Yeah, I like that puzzle weaving, like you say. When you were doing your research and going and looking at comic books from the 70s, was it easy to get them? Is it because you're in the industry, you could just like get a delivery of a box of gigantic box of comic books, or did you have to go and really search around shops?
Oh, I wish I had hard copies. Oh, I did a lot of it digitally. I did a lot of like digital reading on Comixology, or there's a great Marvel app, Marvel Unlimited, where you subscribe, pay a monthly fee, and excuse me, you have access to their entire library, which was amazing. So yeah, I miss, having a New York apartment, space is limited, but I do miss having the long boxes and kind of going through the comics. And I did visit my local comic shop a few times just to kind of get that textural feeling, because that's really important to kind of be able to describe what that's like. But yeah, a lot of it was just on my iPad, which was helpful. I mean, in terms of just like diving in and reading like hundreds of comics without having to worry about like shelving and stuff like that. But I did long for like the smell of like fading paper.
Was there like an old comic book that you became fond of while you were doing some of your research, like like Spider-Woman, or like a specific issue or something like that?
Yeah, Spider-Woman, I think by far became my favorite because it was a character that I had never really been that into as a reader. I mean, I loved Spider-Man, and in the 70s there was this era where Marvel kind of created alternate versions of characters to copyright them, like She-Hulk or Spider-Woman, just to make sure that they had that IP stake. And so I'd never read the original like arc of Spider-Woman, and her origin is so like 70s. It's so confusing. She's like a brainwashed agent of Shield, and she has to, she has a whole hood over her head instead of like the usual costume that we're used to, where it's like her flowing black hair. But I found those stories to be so quirky and evocative, and those little pockets of comics that even then weren't like franchise characters, like the X-Men or Spider-Man or Superman or Batman. You see a lot of weirder things happen, and that really intrigues me as a writer. Like these stories that were just off the beaten path that still fall under the superhero genre. So I found Spider-Woman to be really surprisingly entertaining and really great art. The artist Carmine Infantino is known for like co-creating the Flash and doing a bunch of stuff at DC, but he did a nice run on Spider-Woman, and it's just beautifully illustrated. And so it's like, I think it's like one of these like hidden gems that I was lucky to rediscover.
What were comics like in the 1970s in general for somebody who has never read them? Because I know there was a big shift. There was a big industry shift, and you talk about that in Secret Identity, a little bit of what's going on. But if you could tell some of the people who like haven't read Secret Identity and are just curious about like what's going on, why is Spider-Woman, why was Spider-Woman, I don't know, a secretary?
Yeah, exactly. No, I think the reason I picked 1975 was because it's in such stark contrast to comics today. I mean, there are comic book movies and TV shows of every character, not just like the big characters like Batman and Superman and the Flash. Like it's everybody, like obscure characters like Peacemaker have a TV show, and it's much more about mining IP and creating media and having these like multi-platform empires, which is great. I mean, as a comic fan, it's great that I can put on the TV and watch WandaVision, which is about Scarlet Witch and the Vision, who are arguably not major Avengers characters, but in 1975, no one had that idea. No one understood that these characters would become like these pop culture icons. To a lot of the people working in comics, it was a means to an end, and it was also not a collectible field yet. People didn't buy the comics and bag them and seal them and know that this could fund your kids' college down the line. And there was this is very beaded business talk, but there was no secondary market. You went to the newsstand, and if you saw a comic, you would buy it, and there was no guarantee that the next issue would be there. So it was a very transient and I guess volatile market. And the news, not to get too much into the weeds on this, but the newsstand is a much more volatile market than comic shops. You have to overprint by 70% just to sell X amount. So I think the industry as a whole was teetering, and the people that were working in comics were either super fans like Carmen, like, they just loved comics and wanted to be a part of it in any way, or they were writers and artists who saw it as kind of something to do before they wrote their novel, or did traditional magazine art or did something else, because they never saw it as this like long-term viable business. Even though right around the corner was the advent of comic book shops, which totally changed the industry. Once people could go to a store and could find any comic they wanted, the stories became more serialized, the comics themselves became more collectible, and then you start seeing merchandising like action figures and TV shows, and then the industry completely becomes something else, which is great. I mean, from a business perspective, but in terms of story, there was like a Wild West vibe to the stories coming out in the 70s, because there just wasn't the same level of editorial oversight. Nobody was thinking, well, you can't do that to, Batman because he's going to be a movie. Then it was like, well, whatever. This is, somebody will read the issue and then throw it away, and nobody will remember. So.
And you said you want to go back to comic books in another novel. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so the next book, it's kind of a pseudo sequel, but it'll be set in the modern day. And the way I'm approaching it is it's the opposite side of the coin to Secret Identity. It's it'll feature a new protagonist, a woman who's a cartoonist, a traditional like comic strip artist who's done stuff for like the New Yorker and places like that, who once had a dream to work in superhero comics, but has carved out her own very successful path, but has made it clear that once upon a time she was a fan of this obscure 70s comic called The Legendary Lynx. And then there's an announcement that this company, Triumph Entertainment, has been launched, and they're looking to do a media play for this forgotten hero. And there's a social media uproar basically pushing this artist to apply to get the opportunity to reboot the character. And so she does it. She gets the gig. She decides, I'm going to do my next memoir graphic novel is going to be about this experience. And as she's doing it, she starts getting these anonymous, strange messages, basically hinting that there's more to this character that she loves than she thinks, and that she should dig deeper into that before she starts working too hard on reimagining this character. And so it's about the commodification of art. It's about fandom versus, I guess, artistic merits. And those are things I think we all as artists kind of struggle with. But yeah, so far I'm well into it. It'll be either next year or early the following.
Okay. And I have one more question for you before we go into the ask a question portion. So this is for everybody who's watching and who wants to ask a question. Please add it to the ask a question area, because we will be switching to that in about 3-4 minutes. But before we do that, is there any kind of book that you haven't been able to work on that you would like to work on? And I mean that both in a comic book or like a novel. Is there like something that you have never been able to work on? Like, what would be your dream project? Would it be Superman, Batman, or something totally different?
In terms of like characters that I would love to play with, I mean, I have a great Batman idea in the back of my mind that I would like to someday tell. But in terms of just like genre, I love sci-fi. I wrote a Star Wars novel, which was fun, but I have a real soft spot for like serialized space epics, like Star Trek, but also through the prism of genre. So I have this idea for a kind of Battlestar Galactica, Star Trek type show, but also blending elements of like Jean Le Carré spy novels. And so that's what I'm toying with now. That's not under contract. That is just like at some point. And I know you do so many, you genre hop like I do. So I appreciate that you're able to do that. Has it been hard for you to do that?
Yeah. I think people they
want you to just be one thing.
To stick to your to your lane. So if you go to different lanes, they don't like it so much. But
I know I can't work that way though. I have to like shift gears, otherwise I get bored.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So
thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, no problem. I think so this is the end of my part of the show. I am going to switch it over for the Q&A. Please continue to add your questions in the Q&A if you have any, and Alex will answer them. Thank you so much for chatting with me. It's been really
Sylvia.
fun.
Thanks for everything.
Thank you so much, Sylvia and Alex. That was fascinating. And
okay.
I will tell you that I don't typically read in the genres in which either of you work, and it's a mark of a really good author talk when I'm fascinated, even though I don't read in that genre, or those genres, I should say. So thank you for that. We have a couple of audience questions, and we'll get to those in a second. But first, I just want to remark on your backgrounds. Often when we have people who write in genres that you write in, their backgrounds in Crowdcast reflect somehow those interests. And I'm taken by the fact that you both have kind of these all-purpose looking, it's wonderful. But I'm curious, is this a conscious decision that you've set up very?
I mean, I have like comic book art there.
Aha.
So that's actually a page from the Lynx. That was the page we used in the pitch. Yeah. And then over here is an Archie story that I wrote, and that's a page. And over there is my first full comic book. You can't really see it, so I'm not doing it justice, but yeah.
And you and I have the same lamp. I have to say.
Yeah, it's a great lamp. Yeah, it's kind of domineering, but.
But how about you, Silvia? Is there anything lurking in your background?
I just don't live in a very big place, and a lot of us live here. So
yeah, my kids are over there having dinner, and there's just not a lot of quiet places here.
Gotcha.
No, got it. Yeah, I need to get really rich and buy a mansion. So this stuff, so I can have a real real bookcases and stuff.
Yeah,
I do have to say, I really appreciate electronic books, because what you were saying about space and being able to read a lot of those comic books online and the archives, I do depend a lot on electronic resources nowadays, just because I don't have a space to have a big library. So that's really good. I would like to have one, but.
Yeah, me too. But it was so helpful to not have to like bring long boxes and like sift through them. And, it made it easier. I mean, I am a fan of the print version, but for the purposes of research, it made it much easier.
Right there, that's a really fascinating perspective. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. An audience member, Hillary, who's been very active in
Hi, Hillary.
Chat here. Hi, Hillary. Says, and I'll pose this to both of you. What have you read recently that has brought you joy? Great question, Hillary. I like that.
What have I read recently that's brought me joy? The book I read recently is called Kismet. It's by Amina Akhtar. It's a thriller. It's set in the Sedona wellness industry. It's coming out in August from Thomas and Mercer. And it's just so smart. Amina has a really great voice, very sharp, very funny, but it's also very dark. And I love those kind of books that work on multiple levels, that aren't just a straight hard-boiled mystery, but just she wrote a book called Fashion Victim that was kind of a takedown of the fashion industry in New York, through the prism of a murder mystery. And so I love things that take you somewhere else. Like, I love Velvet Was a Night for the same reason, because it was a great mystery thriller, but I learned so much while I was reading it, and the characters felt so real. And I think, those are the kind of books that stick with me. I'm also reading Devil House, which is by John Darnell, who is the lead singer of the Mountain Goats, but an acclaimed novelist. Oh. And it's I like the meta aspect. It's about a true crime writer buying a house where a crime happened and kind of recounting the crime, but talking about his own experiences as a true crime writer. And then he gets enveloped in something new. And I love those kind of books within a book, I guess.
Yeah, sounds good. How about you, Silvia?
The things that bring me joy are probably the things that scare everybody else. So I read, the best thing that I read recently is this little novella published by Undertow Publications. It's a small Canadian publisher, and they do weird fiction. And it's Naveen Ruthnam, and it's called Help Meet. And it's a historical weird fiction body horror novella.
Oh, cool.
It's very short, and it's also a love story. So it's all those things in once. And it's disgusting. If you read it, you read it and you're like, oh no, what is happening to this person? Kind of like have you ever watched The Fly? The one that Cronenberg made? Yeah, like somebody kind of like transforming. Oh, wow. But I loved it. It's just poetic and beautifully done, and I had a really good time with that one. And it's really short, and I like things that are short. I miss the heyday of the short novel. A lot of the sci-fi novels, and even some of what we consider serious literature, was really very thin. When you see that The Great Gatsby or Ethan Frome are like 30,000 words, 40,000 words, you realize how much the novel has been plumped up through the ages because of changes in technology and also taste. And yeah, so I appreciate a slim, quick read, and this was a slim, quick read. So I had a lot of fun.
Check it out.
And I love that from what you're saying, it sounds like a lot was packed into that. Some quick read. That's really interesting. Of course, our own Mark Twain wrote plumper books for the most part. So we have to advocate for them as well. Matt in the audience says, Alex, what is your process for writing a graphic novel? How do you fit the story to the layout? Now, that's the kind of question we love to talk about here.
That's a good question. I guess for the purposes of secret identity, I didn't, I went through the same work I would do to create a new character. I didn't, we didn't just say, oh, we're only going to do 12 pages, so we just need to worry about those 12 pages. I created the character of the Lynx, obviously with Carmen in mind, created her secret identity of Claudia Cala, and also her supporting cast, her villains, her world, living in this fictional city, Triumph City. And then I reached out to Sandy Jarrell, who did the illustrations in the book. And I love his art because he's not only a great artist, but he can also evoke the era without making it seem like he's imitating anyone. And he loves comic book history. He creates these very elaborate homages to old covers. And he did one for the Lynx that was amazing that we didn't get to use in the book, but we ended up showing in kind of the promotion. But so the way it would work is I would send him a little paragraph, and for like the opening sequence, I said, well, let's show, this will be 2 or 3 pages, show the Lynx jumping over through the rooftops. She'll throw a star, she'll hit her target, then she'll tackle him and interrogate him for a minute. And then we end on a close-up shot of her being surprised as a clue is revealed. And then Sandy would take that and lay out the pages and do like a rough layout, not a little bit more elaborate than stick figures, but just like showing the motion and the panel breakdowns. And I would then write the script, the lettering script. And basically all that is captions, like her internal monologue, any dialogue that she would have with this criminal, and then sound effects like swoosh when the star is flying through the air, or thump if she's like knocking him to the ground, without overdoing it. And then Taylor Esposito, who was the letterer, would actually do it on the computer, but he used a font that was as close to like handwritten as possible, because we didn't want it to seem like it was done by a computer. We wanted it to evoke that feeling of somebody sitting over the board and lettering by hand, which is how they did it back then. And then Sandy would finish the art, and they would layer the letters on top of the finished art, and we would kind of proof and go from there. But those are how the sequences came together, which was a lot of fun. A nice like brain shift from just sitting and writing the prose.
And I imagine the kind of collaborative aspect of that must have been pretty rewarding too. I mean, the story came from you, but it sounds like you had some help in.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 paths when you create a comic book. You either do a straight script where the writer just details like panel 1, Alex walks in with a smile on his face, SFX slam, like you kind of outline it panel by panel and explain the action in detail, and the artist just draws that, which is fine, especially if you don't know the artist. You can have more control. But with Sandy, I knew he was good. He's great. And I ceded a little bit of that control to let him kind of cut loose. And I guess the best example is I'm like the screenwriter and he's the director. So he's choosing the camera angles, he's choosing the tone and the pace. And I wanted to have him to have that freedom. And the end result, I think, was good. It ended up being much more collaborative than me just giving him a very detailed script.
Fascinating. So, Alex, you mentioned your children, and we were talking about them in the green room. You've obviously been at this work for much longer than you've had children, but being a father, has it changed your approach to your work, your writing work? I know you have other work. And do you think about the legacy you're leaving your children and how they might respond to your body of work?
It has changed my work in that I don't have the luxury of, when I was single and living alone, I could sit and write for like 2 or 3 hours, but I somehow maintain my productivity, which I think is just being aware of time. If my daughter's napping, I can sprint for like 20 minutes. And I think it's taught me to deceremonialize the process. I don't think too much about like being in a certain mindset or kind of having things a certain way for me to write. Like if I can crack open my laptop and write for a few minutes, then that's a victory. And in terms of legacy, I mean, I think they just see what I do, and hopefully that's useful to them. I know my son is aware that I write these books. I think he's not fully aware. He's 6 now, so he's aware that they exist. He can't read them yet, but I hope they appreciate it years from now, but I can't control. I think they think it's cool. My daughter recognizes the Secret Identity cover, and she's like, "That's your favorite book." She's gonna be 3, so
that's awesome.
Yeah, kids are funny.
They are terribly funny. Sylvia, you mentioned that it sounded like that you said you live in a small space, and there are others. I love this word that you used, Alex, ceremonializing. What is your writing process, and do you ceremonialize your return to the keyboard every day, or are you a pragmatist as Alex seems to be?
Oh no, I worked a 9-to-5 job for all my life, basically. I stopped doing that only at the beginning of this year. Right now, I'm a full-time writer, but what that means is that I'm a full-time freelancer. So I do writing for like a university. You know, I might do a story for somebody for like corporate communications, which was my job before, that kind of stuff. And then I also have my fiction. And so what happens if you're working in corporate communications, which is the gig that I've always had, is that if you don't, you know, if you don't deliver the thing by the deadline, then you get fired, right? Or you don't get hired again. So that would make you a really bad freelancer. So yeah, writers are basically, working writers are, for the most part, working freelancers. The only one who isn't is maybe George R.R. Martin, because he can just do whatever he wants, but I respond to the demands of, you know, of whoever is hiring me for something, or I'm doing things like events, and that also either I get paid or help my career or that kind of stuff. So yeah, no, there's no ceremonializing. I work whenever I can and how I can. Because yeah, I'm the breadwinner for my family, and I do have a family. It just keeps expanding. So
yeah, same. You just you have to. It's work, but it's fun sometimes.
I'm so glad you shared that with us, both of you. And you know, it really does. People who don't write for a living have this notion of writer's block. If you're an actual writer who's making a living writing or trying to, you can't even afford to think about writer's block. You just have to sit down and write. And make it happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, the bad words are going to come. You know, the first draft is never going to be great. It's just you just need to get it on paper. I think so. I mean, I don't have the luxury of, I don't know. I don't want to call writer's block a luxury. I think if you are feeling it, you're feeling it. But I've always found that you just kind of take a break and do something else, and then come back to it.
Yeah. I came to writing through working in communications, journalism, that kind of stuff. And I think it's a very different mindset when you come through that than people that I've met who go through an MFA. They have a totally different mindset than I do. So I'm definitely, give me the word count, give me the deadline. There's columns per inches no longer mean what they did, but it used to be, you know, give me the columns per inches and the rate, and I'll get back to you.
Yeah, exactly. Like that journalism. I think journalism does teach you you care about the words and the word choice, but you also understand the deadline and that you just need to get there.
Yeah. That was fascinating. Thank you for that. Joe Wynn in our audience has a question for both of you. Where do you draw the line between real history / culture and your own story so both can naturally coexist? Is that something either or both of you can talk about?
I mean, I guess fiction and history. I mean, I use the historical elements as a backdrop and context, and you know, I try to have the fictional elements exist in parallel with history and not interfere with history. You know, I wanted to make sure in Secret Identity that I didn't have anything that was anachronistic or also contradicted any like historical fact, but the comic book history in Secret Identity is very much like the backdrop, and it adds texture. And Carmen's story, I strove for verisimilitude to make it feel like it could have happened. That's like in my dream, someone will read the book and imagine that maybe there is a Legendary Lynx comic book out there, and that's when you do the job right. But yeah, I try to, you know, I think the history complements the fiction, and at the end of the day, it's fiction.
How about you, Sylvia? Anything you'd like to add or talk about?
Yeah, no, I try to get as many details right as I can. And then, but then there's the aspect of likelihood versus reality. So I'm doing something right now where I have a female sound editor in 1990s Mexico. And I know that field, you know, from being kind of in that milieu for a little while. And there were basically, I mean, sound editors are still very rare, and they were basically almost none or zero sound editors in that time point in Mexico doing the kind of work that I'm talking about. So is that, am I absolutely realistic? And so then I don't have a female protagonist, I have a male one because that was the reality of the time period. Or do I say, you know, this is a rare occurrence, but it could have happened kind of situation. And so I'm going for the, well, it's a rare occurrence, but, you know, maybe there might have been somebody. But if I wanted to be like totally, absolutely 100% accurate, I would probably have like an all male cast, because that was a reality of what when you went into a post-production studio, that's what it was. And even when I was working in post-production in the 2000s, even in Canada, I was the only woman in the shop except for the receptionist. So even like 15 years later, it was still a very male dominated world. So if I wanted to be completely accurate, yeah, it would be like I couldn't have a female in the story. It would have to be an all male cast. But where do you know, how much do you stray from reality into this aspect of fiction? There's, you know, maybe a little bit of leeway of license there, but in other aspects, I am very much like, I can tell you how much something cost, you know, at the time, what the fare for a bus was, or what subway stations were operating in the city that I'm looking at. All that kind of stuff is definitely real. You can move your way through the city, basically. In most of my novels, if you pin pins on a map, you can move your way around the city, and all the neighborhoods are real, and the streets are real, and the businesses are probably real. Some of them are maybe still there, even depending on what I'm talking about. Even from the book that I said in the 1970s, Velvet Was a Night, there's some businesses that are still there, and you can like go on the pin and on the trail and look for them. But some other aspects are obviously fictionalized for greater drama, which is that other aspect of like, well, what is the likelihood of this specific kind of character being in that place and time? Your mileage may vary on that, but I try to make everything so realistic that the parts that are maybe more unlikely seem likely.
Yeah, sometimes you have to bend a little bit to the story.
Yeah.
So we only have a minute or so, and I think the audience doesn't seem to have more questions, but I do want to ask to kind of build on what we're just talking about, this idea of world building. And it sounds like you both spend a lot of time thinking about the worlds in which your work is set. Are there sometimes things that you know about that world that don't even appear in the book that you produce, that you just know as part of your having created this world in your head?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always a lot of stuff that you have to create, like character bios. Or, I mean, I don't do extensive character bios, but I did for this book, I created a lot of secondary material. Like, I think with the interludes, we very smartly didn't include them, but there were like interviews. Like the book initially started with a very academic essay on, you know, whatever happened to the legendary Lynx, to kind of give it this context in the industry. There was an interview with Jeffrey Carlisle, who is the kind of blowhard boss that doesn't give Carmen an opportunity in the beginning of the novel. But there's an interview with him in the 90s via Wizard magazine, which was like the hot magazine in comics at the time. And so I wanted to just kind of add more things that would really lock the story into comic book history. But I think sometimes you try it and it works, and other times you just trim to kind of keep the focus of the book. And I think there's writers, I think there's always stuff that just makes it, just lands on the cutting room floor.
Sure. Sylvia, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I kind of made the mistake of adding this. I did a vampire novel called Certain Dark Things, and it has this back matter where it's called Encyclopedia Vampirica. And although only 3 types of vampires appear in my novel, in the back you can see all of them. It's like this kind of Wikipedia entries of vampires. And I thought it would be fun for fans. It's like an extra, you know. I was never gonna like write about those vampires, but this is some of the stuff that I imagined that didn't go into the main narrative of the book. And for years, I've had people kind of saying, why is that thing on the back? Like, it doesn't make sense. Why isn't it, you know, like, and they want to see like other books, or why is it not integrated into the text? And so like, I was like, holy moly, I should have just left it on the cutting room floor. To me, it was just like an extra, like a behind the scenes kind of thing. Like if people wanted to read it, it was kind of cute and cool. But it just caused so much confusion and sometimes even rage in people because they were like, I wanted to see that vampire, and it doesn't appear in the novel.
There's no pleasing everyone.
There are the other novels. So yeah, so there's a lot of stuff that goes into the cutting room floor, but by now I've learned to just leave it there because there's no no good things will come out of that. I've done some stuff. Win. I have a Patreon, and sometimes I have posted some bits of writing that are not included in some of my novels, like an opening scene for Mexican Gothic that I didn't end up using and that kind of stuff. But I'm doing it like there, kind of like in private, because I've learned that if I do it in public, then some people really are like, no, I don't like that. Or I like it so much, I would have rather had it this way. And then, it's like they sense a deficit.
Becomes a thing.
Yeah. So that's my solution now. It's just like, no more of those appendices and extra content for you guys. Sorry.
That's good. I'm glad I came to the same conclusion through a different path.
Well, my gosh, it is already 7 o'clock. I can't believe it. What a wonderful hour this has been. Thank you both, Alex and Silvia, for spending this time with us and talking. I cannot imagine that if you had not already made up your mind, audience members, to purchase Secret Identity, that you haven't changed your mind by now. The link is right there in the chat. And again, you get a signed copy because Alex was kind enough to sign book plates for us. And your purchase does support the museum, which is very important to everybody involved. Will you come back and do this again soon? And actually, more important than that, will you come visit the Mark Twain house in person? We'd love to have you.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Silvia, for doing this. It was fun to chat with you.
And Jacques is saying what we were saying earlier. We'd love to have you, Silvia, when your book comes out in, did you say August?
In July. Yeah.
July. Okay. Well, let's talk. Okay. And maybe Alex can come back and you guys can swap duties.
Happy to do it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, audience, for being here, for your great questions. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Silvia. And everybody have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Silvia. Thank you.
Bye-bye.